Wolf Man is a horror film released by Universal Pictures on December 12, 1941. The film was written by Kurt Siodmak and was directed by George Wagner. The film stars Lon Chaney Jr., Claude Rains, Warren William, Ralph Bellamy, and Evelyn Ankers. Throughout history, there have been a select few monsters that have imprinted their terrifying visage in the minds of the impressionable more effectively than the werewolf, the deformed and vicious combination of both man and his best friend. The twisted irony of how this form of 1 + 1 doesn't equal 2 has haunted people's dreams for countless centuries, and the advent of modern storytelling through movies and pop culture did absolutely nothing to abate that terror. The Wolfman is one of the earliest and most culturally impactful examples of the werewolf in cinema, with the movie kick-starting the career of Hollywood superstar Lon Chaney Jr. and helping to reinforce Universal Pictures' reputation for memorable silver screen spooks. But being nearly a century removed from its original release, many people tend not to pay this movie lip service beyond acknowledging its existence. So what does this film do that gives it a place in the history of pop culture? What makes this the one that started it all? In this review, we're hunting down the beast that haunts the night and attempting to learn what is buried beneath its wicked facade. Just as a warning to those of you who haven't seen this movie yet, there are major spoilers ahead. If you wish to see this movie for yourself, without having anything spoiled for you, please click off the video now. Now, without further ado, let's get into it. The story begins with the arrival of Larry Talbot in his hometown. He has returned from overseas after being gone 18 years in order to assume his brother's status as heir to the estate, following his brother's untimely death. Larry reconciles the past with his father, John, before getting settled in, helping his father with installing a telescope. While Larry is fiddling with the telescope, he sees a woman on the top floor of the antique shop in town. Curious, Larry goes to the shop and strikes up a conversation with the woman, whose name is Gwen, buying a cane with a silver handle from her before insisting they go out on a date later that night. Larry meets with Gwen and her friend Jenny later that night, and the three go to a traveling band of gypsies to have their fortunes told. Jenny goes in first while Larry and Gwen take a walk. While having her fortune told, the fortune teller begins to act strangely, demanding she leave at once. Jenny, frightened by the sudden change in behavior, runs off into the surrounding woods. While Larry and Gwen are talking, they hear a scream erupt from the woods. Larry takes off to investigate, finding a wolf leering over the lifeless body of Jenny. He rips the wolf off of her, beating it to death with his silver-handled cane, but is bitten in the process. Gwen finds Larry hunched over in pain, and with the assistance of one of the elder gypsy ladies, Gwen brings Larry home. The police go to investigate the scene of the crime, finding Jenny with bite marks on her neck. But next to her lies the body of the fortune teller, savagely beaten to death. After Larry awakens, he is questioned by the local police about the previous night. When the police inform him about their discovery of the fortune teller's body, Larry gets flustered, adamant that he killed the wolf, even if the police didn't find it. As the fortune teller is interred in the crypt, word begins to spread that Larry was responsible for killing him. Having been told tales of the werewolf by Gwen, Larry sneaks into the crypt, searching for clues that might explain the truth. While there, he sees the elder gypsy woman who helped him home, mourning over the casket of the fortune teller. The sight of this causes Larry to break down, feeling the guilt of actions he himself does not remember. Later on, Larry attends a carnival put on by the gypsies to try and clear his head, but he runs into Gwen and her fiancé, Frank. Larry, after becoming disturbed during a friendly shooting match with Frank, runs off, running into the elder gypsy woman. She explains to him that he did in fact kill the fortune teller, who was a werewolf. She also gifts him a pendant, explaining those who are bitten by a werewolf are doomed to become one themselves. Larry leaves, briefly meeting with Gwen, whom he promptly gives the pendant to. The two share a kiss before the gypsies are seen frantically packing up their trappings and leaving. After asking what's going on, one of the gypsies tells Larry that a werewolf is coming. Larry stumbles home, terrified as he strips off his clothes, finding fur already growing out of his legs. Before anything can be done, Larry transforms into a werewolf, taking off to the town cemetery. He kills the cemetery keeper before fleeing back to the mansion, leaving the body to be found by the local police. Larry awakens the next morning, with paw prints on his carpet and no memory of the previous night. After a brief conversation with his father about the idea of werewolfism, the two go to the service held for the dead gravedigger, but Larry is panicked by the stares of the funeral goers, leaving before the service can begin. Later that night, the police set out traps, believing they are going to catch a wolf. Larry, having transformed, gets his leg caught in the trap, but with the assistance of the elderly gypsy woman, Larry transforms back to human form and evades the patrolling men. He goes to Gwen, telling her he must leave. Though she insists on coming with him, Larry says he cannot risk it. Upon saying this, he sees a pentagram in Gwen's hand, a sign that she will be his next victim. Distraught, Larry runs back home, where after attempting to convince his father John of his condition, he is tied to a chair in order to prove that nothing is wrong with him. Before John goes to join the hunt for the werewolf, Larry begs him to take his silver-handled cane. John relents and takes the cane to meet the local hunting party. During the night, the police and hunters of the patrol spot the transformed Larry, firing at him as he runs through the woods. Gwen shows up, attempting to find Larry in the midst of the chaos, but is attacked by the transformed Larry. John catches up to Larry, and after a brief struggle, John gets the upper hand, bludgeoning Larry to death with the silver cane. In the final moments of the movie, John and Gwen watch in horror as the beast at their feet slowly transforms back into Larry, just in time for the patrol to arrive to the site. Despite being filmed nearly a century ago, this movie is actually quite enjoyable to watch. Though there are certainly aspects of this movie that definitely didn't age well, there's still a surprising amount of entertainment value to be had, courtesy of how much effort actually went into making it. The story of this movie is considerably deeper than anyone would expect from a black and white monster flick. Though it is not able to scare us with the ghoulish images or bloody horror you would expect from facing creatures of the night, it makes up for it by building its atmosphere around the repercussions of its events. As time goes by and the threat of the werewolf becomes more pronounced, people become more and more paranoid and desperate towards the people around them, with a lot of that ire being directed towards Larry, who knows full well that he is no longer the man he was. Larry's descent into grief as he desperately tries to understand his condition, and later on, make efforts to try and save the people he loves, is actually quite gripping to watch. His search for answers and people to confide in end up introducing another layer of complexity in just how people view the idea of the werewolf. Themes of mental illness and the impact it has on the mind end up being touched upon, with other musings leaning on the ideas of the divide that exists between the scientific and mystical worlds and human nature as a whole. It's a surprisingly philosophical film given the subject matter, but this works to give the film a layer of depth that helps elevate the stakes behind Larry's slow loss of control. Lon Chaney Jr.'s large frame may be deceptive in convincing people he was only chosen because he was big and imposing as the Wolfman. While this is true to an extent, his performance as Larry is far more involved and realistic than it has any right to be. Every scene he's in is loaded with self-reflection and emotion, giving an honest look into the mind of a man grappling with forces beyond his understanding. Larry is an outsider going into this story, but his involvement with the death of the fortune teller raises even more suspicion and distrust of him, making his attempts to work through and understand the nature of what has happened to him that much harder. Chaney absolutely leans into this portrayal of an emotionally fraying mind, and scenes like his investigation of the crypt, or his meetings with his father and the townspeople, or an especially memorable scene at the cemetery worker's funeral, when every single person in the church turns to stare him down. That scene honestly gave me chills. The movie's other performances are also pretty good at setting the tone and atmosphere of a town on the verge of losing its mind. Claude Rains as the calming and rational voice of Larry's father is another standout. His caring yet stern visage, combined with his musings on human nature and the scientific versus the mystical, help to ground Larry in his more desperate moments, and add an introspective element to the mythos that you wouldn't normally consider. All around, just a solid turnout in the acting department. Even though this take on the story is an interesting one, there are still a few issues with it that keep it from being a true standout. The love story that exists between Larry and Gwen, as is the case with most movies from the time, is pretty forced. I will admit the chemistry between the two actors is pretty decent, but it's hard to buy into the idea that Gwen, over the 5 scenes she shares with Larry, falls head over heels in love with him. The ending of the movie also proves to be disappointing, with the scene of a horrified John realizing he just murdered his son, cutting to black as soon as the townspeople come along and blurt out "case solved." Which brings us neatly along to the other major issue that plagues this movie. The scene transitions are super abrupt, cutting scenes off the millisecond they finish delivering their contribution to the overall story. These aren't smooth exits either. A hard cut to black or a hard wipe is usually what transports you into the next scene. The runtime for this movie is incredibly short, clocking in at just over an hour, and the further you get into the movie, the more it feels like scenes are cutting to black 2 minutes before they're supposed to. There's a lot of trace additions to scenes that, had they been added, could have really helped with the movie's flow, but for whatever reason, it rushes towards its climax, and the end result is honestly underwhelming. There are other aspects of this film that are certainly dated, which, depending on who you are, may potentially break your concentration. The music they use honestly sounds like a rehash of every other vintage black and white movie that half the human race can put a name to, but it's not something that shows up too often, and it works well within the confines of the film. The makeup is another aspect of this movie that's dated, given how far it came in the years following. While it certainly won't look like much to modern movie audiences, it also doesn't pop up very often. And honestly, it actually looks good for what it is. You can tell with this movie, for the most part anyway, a lot of effort was put into making it, even if it doesn't measure up to modern competition. The final rating for this dog walk in the pale moonlight is 7 out of 10. It is an all-around interesting exploration of the mythos of a legendary cryptid, with acting far greater than what one would expect. Even with some admittedly dead-end storytelling, clunky scene progression, and dated effects, this is a worthwhile watch for both film enthusiasts and casual audiences alike. Just try not to pay too much attention to the obvious cash cows that followed in its footsteps.
And that will be it for today. Thank you all for stopping by. If for whatever reason you enjoyed what you saw today, consider sticking around, maybe leaving a like or subscribing if you wish. And if you have any recommendations for movies you want to see reviewed in the future, be sure to drop those down in the comments. There's plenty more to come, so if that's something you care about, I'll see you when I see you.